Welcome back to the Pursuit podcast. We're looking at some profiles of technologists who've gotten into the industry without a degree, who've gone on to do some really incredible things. I'm speaking today with
Katie Cunningham, CTO of Speak Agent.
You're the CTO. You're the big boss.
I am. I like to call it last nerd standing because that's honestly what it feels like some days. Because you just realize that all the tricky little weird decisions that managers were making when you were a senior developer or lead developer or junior, all of a sudden you're the one making all those tricky, terrible decisions. And so it does feel like you're the last nerd standing some days.
So less complaining about what the boss has done and more realizing that you are the boss and you've got to do it.
Yes. And oh no, what are they saying?
What would I say in this position myself?
Yeah.
So how'd you wind up doing that? So you came in without a degree. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you got started in the industry and what it felt like, maybe what some of the challenges were?
Well, I know that one of the challenges was getting my foot in the door. I was very lucky. A friend of mine was working at NASA at the time, and I had to leave school because in my sophomore year, I became pregnant. And I decided, I'm like, no, I'm going to try to make this work. I'm going to leave school for a bit, get everything back in order.
Well, you were building and shipping a small human. Like it's not a small thing. It's a big deal.
Right. And so I was like, I will figure this out, but I'll be right back. And this was the naivete of like the late 90s. Late 90s, early aughts. And I did leave school for a while and found a good job. My fiance at the time, found a good job. We were settled. Then I got laid off. And then I did find a new job that I'm like, okay, this will be flexible. This will be fine. And then 9/11 happened. And suddenly everything in our area cratered because I'm from the DC area. And the industry at the time in that area is normally pretty recession-proof, but even there were a lot of struggles as the economy collapsed. And we struggled with layoffs. We struggled with not getting promotions, not getting raises. It wasn't uncommon to not get even a cost of living raise for several years, even though you're promised one every year. So it was very difficult. And I had a friend who worked at NASA, and he's like, hey, look, where you are, they're paying you peanuts. Why don't you interview with us?
Is that how NASA does a lot of hiring, sort of a friend of a friend?
Well, these are contracts. And the thing about NASA and actually any government agency is it's going to be mostly contractors. That's just how it is. They end up getting contractors in for certain things. So you end up having government people doing either things that have to be done by government people that they can't outsource, or they're managing contractors, or they're doing something, it's doing different kinds of support where it's weird and complicated. I grew up in DC and it makes total sense to me, but to everyone else, it makes no sense. But yes.
Sorry to pull you over. I was just wondering, there might be other people out there. As soon as you said that, I instantly wanted to drop everything and make friends with people at NASA.
But yeah, absolutely, because that is often how people know when the contracts are opening. So you know where to apply, because many contracting companies actually can't say who they are contracting with. They can't say, this is a Department of Library contract that I am recruiting you for. Or they don't do it for some reason.
You've got to be very gentle. So like, hey, do you like rockets?
Yeah, they'll tend to tell you once you get into the interview, like that's fine, but seeking them out, you can't actually Google like that very easily. So it's easier if you do have somebody who's a friend there who can say, yeah, okay, I'm passing along your resume to the contract to interview you. So anyway, I got the job. I was a business analyst. I eventually was moved over to the coding side as I showed I showed a lot of interest in it, and they actually had a need. They needed another body coding, and they needed my body coding more than they needed my body doing business analyst stuff.
And that sounds like a really fantastic pivot. You've come in and you said, well, actually, I can also do this, and you need this, so make room.
Yeah. And that is kind of what happened, that the developers just kind of slowly claimed me because they needed somebody else in there doing work. We had other people that could do the business analyst stuff, but that's kind of how I got my start, that I went from NASA to Cox Media Group, and I was there developer the entire time, which that was my first, like, I am 100% a developer the entire time. I was there for 3 years, and then I moved over to Speak Agent, where I started as a senior developer and then got promoted to the director of technology or something like that. And yeah, I didn't have that title very long because then I became CTO.
Were there any points during this where there were sort of challenges where people stopped to ask, hey, wait, where's your degree?
Well, what's funny is my boss, when he was interviewing me, I joked that I had 90% of a psychology degree, which is true. That's kind of the point where I stopped. He is very education focused, like in traditional education, like, okay, you leave high school and you go to college and then you get a master's degree. And that is like everyone does everything. And the idea that somebody would not have a college degree and would not care baffled him. And he's like, well, wait, you don't have a full degree. What, are you going back to finish it? And I was like, am I going back to finish my psychology degree for my new technical job? No, I am not. There's no reason to do this. And he was like, but, well, can you send me some, like, were you in any clubs during that time? Did you get any awards? Can you send me those?
So this is like 10 years back.
Yeah. And I said, dude, I am 34. I am over a decade out of when I did any of that. No, I'm not going to send that to you. I don't keep them on a shelf, And I was flatly honest with him. I said, I am the perfect person for this job. I hit every single of the boxes you have that you need everything from. You need somebody who's educated in the special education market, who is a coder that can do these specific things, that works in this specific geographical region for this amount that you're paying, and has also I'm a nerd. I will pick up anything you need because I love, and we're a language company, so I had to pick up linguistics.
This is massively interesting.
So I had to pick up linguistics and that kind of stuff. And I said, you're not going to find someone like me. There aren't any other candidates in the area. And he did kind of go, oh, okay. He kind of realized, I think, what he had said, that it was a little bit insulting.
I generally hate the term unicorn, but it is a little bit like trying to send a unicorn to night school.
Yeah, it is. And I think I even called myself a unicorn, if not in that meeting, then in a later one.
Yeah.
Actually, no, I think it was in a later one. After I'd been hired, we were talking about hiring a junior, and there was something very tricky I was doing. And he's like, well, a junior could do this. And I'm like, honey, no. Juniors cannot write linguistic software that meets these business needs. I said, this is not a junior thing. And he's like, well, you did it. I said, I'm a unicorn. I am different.
This is very early on in the interview to say you're my hero, but between the whole, I just rocked up to NASA, and of course you're going to hire me, who else is there, is absolutely glorious.
Oh, thank you. I don't recommend that swagger to most younger developers. I tell this story and then I'm like, but don't do that, because I knew what I was saying was true. It wasn't a bluff. But I also was very free to walk away from that interview. That if I didn't walk away with that job, I had 3 other people on the line. So I wasn't sweating it.
So never, ever, ever do this unless you really, really want to and you have a backup.
Right. That's my big thing. It's and don't do it just because I did it because I had a feeling if he values education this much, I need to know if this is going to affect the rest of our negotiation.
And I think that's something people often forget when they're looking for work, especially looking for work in someplace that's relatively high demand like technology, is after you get that first job, which can be a huge challenge, especially without a degree, you've got a lot more flexibility for future jobs. They're not just interviewing you, you're also interviewing them.
Yes. I actually gave a talk on Pi Ohio this weekend called The Humane Technical Interview, where it's really more talking to people who give interviews about doing ones that are more humane. But one of the slides I have is, remember that the interviewee is the interviewer. So you do have to remember that the person who is interviewing, you are interviewing, is also checking you out to see, like, what are you like? So when you do some of these terrible interview things, they are remembering. They're remembering everything, and they are weighing whether they would actually want to take the job. I've actually know people that have said, I'm not taking this job. They were jerks. I had another person who raised his price by like 30K.
Yep.
US, because he was like, they were such jerks during this that I decided the only way I would work for them is if they paid me like this absurd amount of money. And they did. Like, that was the funny thing. They did. It's just one of those things people have to keep in mind.
And it doesn't just impact your ability to hire that specific person. It impacts the ability to hire anyone that person interacts with,
Yes.
on or offline.
Oh, yes.
And especially if you're in a very, very niche space, if you're doing something with linguistics in Python, if you're doing something, I'm just coming out of the developer relations sector where like people all know who you don't want to interview with.
Mm-hmm.
It can cost your business, it can cost your team quite a bit if you have bad interview practices and bad hiring practices.
Yeah, and we are some very chatty people. Because I know that's well known, like how certain companies interview, that I've gotten lots of stories. And when I was collecting stories for this talk. I had people who came to me and told me such wonderful stories and named names. Everyone named names for the bad interview stories, because we do want to warn each other.
So there was this one barrier that you had the skills, you knew your value, you knew what you were doing, and just sort of ran directly over that. That's fantastic.
It does cause some anxiety. I won't lie. For anybody that's listening to this and saying, oh, then I don't need the degree. It is nerve-wracking sometimes that I don't have that box checked, to the point where I've considered going back and just getting those last few classes and getting them done and just being done with it, so that I can now say I have a degree and we don't have to have the conversation, because you do end up justifying yourself. And unfortunately, the way I usually are like, well, why didn't you finish? I either have to say that's private, or I have to go through the story of, well, I got pregnant when I was, 20 years old. That just, it happened. And you have to get into private area, because nobody ever leaves college for reasons that don't come with any judgment.
And talking about leaving to have children, or even having children in an interview or hiring process, can make things a lot more challenging for you, recognizing that those biases are real.
Oh, yes. I've been lucky in that every time I've been looking for a job, I've had a job. So I've actually had like a lot of freedom to just go in and say, if I don't get this one, there'll be another one. I can keep looking. I'm also very lucky in that the language I work in is very popular. Python is what I code in, and Python is extremely popular, and there's a lot of call for it. So I've never had any shortage of companies, banging on my door. So I've been lucky, but it's always been in the back of my mind that if I had to find a job like tomorrow and did not have any backups, not having the degree definitely is one of those things that it's nerve-wracking to share with somebody, because you will have companies that outright will not look at you, even though I'm a highly qualified candidate. And there are lots of highly qualified candidates who do not have the exact degree that they want, because there's a lot of people who go to college. I actually did take a couple of computer science classes in college. My original plan was that I was going to be dual degree psychology and computer science, because I was an overachiever like you would not believe.
I would totally believe.
Oh my God, I was such I look back at young me and I am like, honey, slow down. This is why you ended up with ulcers by 18. So I was a huge overachiever, and it wasn't good enough just to have one. I had to have two majors, and and a minor. I was going to have a minor too.
What were you going to minor in?
I was going to minor in like visual design.
Of course you were.
Of course. Because that makes
total. You only have two majors and a minor. I mean, if you could have gotten a couple more in there, yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, and don't think I didn't look to see if there was one more I could sneak in. But yeah, I had two majors. So I did take a couple computer science classes. I didn't get very high up in it because I had started the psych stuff first, and then there's only so much, like computer science was stacked in a certain way you couldn't flood your schedule until later. So I took those classes, and so I took some formal computer science stuff, and I had been doing it informally for years. And I was going somewhere with this, but I still didn't have the full degree. And that, some places, because I can't reverse a B tree, or I can't talk about these much higher level concepts in an academic way, I would be rejected straight out. And I say it in an academic way, which is important because many times if you go into these meetings and they say, how would you do this? If you don't use the right language, they reject you.
That's such a valuable point.
Yeah, and it's like, look, I know how views work. I know how object-oriented programming works. I use it every day because I do Django. I know how these things work. I just didn't have the formal sit down in class, take notes, take a test on it kind of experience with it. I learned it through using something else, and I read enough on it to understand it, but there's a lot of language that's lost between school and work. A lot of words that just stop getting used.
And a lot of that as well is, it seems very often, whether or not it's deliberate, to be a filter for people who have degrees. I think a lot of that is coming from interviewers who do have a degree themselves or have come from an academic route or have learned their interview skills from someone else who has a degree. And it's kind of the fossilized remains of asking what they think they need versus asking to be shown that you have the skills.
Oh yeah, I consider it it's almost like a hazing.
Yeah.
Like a version of hazing, like this was done so horribly to me, it must be done to you this way because I turned out fine. So if you were going to be fine, you need to go through this. And one of the things that I did in my talk, because this right now is like at the top of my brain because I worked on this talk for weeks and then just gave it like the past week, is the fact that these are kind of usually invisible biases that somebody may say, oh, we don't actually require a degree, but then you ask all these questions that can only be answered by somebody who went through a computer science program, means you are filtering for them. And you're also filtering for people, like, to be honest, that don't remember college. And
yeah,
I'm 37, and if you sat me down and asked me to retake a test that I took when I was 18 in like the midpoint through my CS 100 class, there's a good chance I wouldn't be able to do it, like just off the bat. I'd have to look a bunch of stuff up, and I would have to say, oh my God, how did that work again? There's some things like I still remember kind of how they work, but I won't remember the exact term, or I would be Googling everything, and to expect somebody to be able to do this on the spot is another kind of weird, like.
And quite often you'll see people asking that you reproduce this knowledge immediately, reproduce it in academic language, and reproduce it in a way that isn't natural.
No, like in a whiteboard.
Yeah, I of course, exactly the same as you've suggested. Do as I say, not as I do. But I've walked out of interviews when they're like, hi, put this code up on a whiteboard. It just doesn't imply a very clear knowledge of what you're testing for or that you know what you're doing.
Yeah, I had to put together a technical interview because we were hiring technical people. And we were like, and finally, like, my boss was like, oh, we're going to hire another developer. And I'm like, oh, thank God. And he's like, okay, we'll need to do a technical interview. And I'm like, great, yeah. And there was this long, like, awkward pause. And he's like, well, you need to make one. It's like, oh, no, now I have to do this. So what I ended up doing for mine, and this is for any people who are going to be writing interviews at any point in the near future, I actually put together one that was boring because all it was I wanted you to look at some code that was like the code that we do at our job. Very, very similar. It actually mimicked one of our libraries and one of our modules. And I asked you, it's like, hey, here's a few things. Can you add a few new attributes? Can you add a new model? Can you do, just some very basic stuff for the test to see, like, okay, who can just past this to can you do these everyday things that we need to do? And it was actually really interesting to see what people did with it because it was more open-ended. I set the bar very low.
And very show me something meaningful that's relevant.
Right. And my thing, it's like, look, you've got a week because people are working. And even if you're not working, you're job hunting, you're busy. So I gave everyone a week. They could ask me as many questions as they wanted. And at the end of the day, all it needed to do was that they needed to satisfy the requirements and it needed to work. Like that was it. And what was interesting was seeing where people vaulted over, like how far people went, because they would look at this thing and they would go, oh, I can see some other ways that this could be done. And you could actually see more of their creative process when you're putting them in their natural environment, because they could work on their own computer in their natural environment. They could they figure things out? Because there was a few things like they had to use Django REST framework that they had to, and that was kind of the thing. I was like, you have to use it. I know you probably don't know how to use it, but you have to figure it out because that is our backbone of our API is built upon this framework.
And also really testing for, are you comfortable poking around with something new?
Yeah. And I was like, you have to use Django REST framework and you have to deploy to Heroku because Heroku is something else we use. So push it up to Heroku and send the links to me. So it ended up being great because people really did like show me how far they could go. And it created more conversations rather than setting the bar super high and seeing who could possibly like manage to kind of get their way over it. I wanted to see how high people could jump.
Oh, cool. So just say, hey, here's the space we're going to be jumping in. Instead of setting a high hurdle, say, show me what you want to do. Show me what you can do.
Yes.
How wonderful. That must have been a really, really interesting experience, having come from a background without a degree yourself, having come this winding and beautiful route into tech leadership yourself, giving people the space and creativity to show you what they thought of a new framework, what they thought they could do in a new environment.
Yep. Yeah, it was definitely a really interesting experience, and that's why I ended up doing a talk about it. A talk that I'm really fond of because I thought it came off really well.
And we'll be linking to the video. Will there be video of that?
Yes, there is video. They got the video up.
Fantastic. We'll be linking to the video in the show notes. You've given us a lot of really, really interesting looks at what you've done and how you've done it. And one really, really important point, the whole don't go in extremely cocky unless you're a unicorn, maybe. What kind of advice would you give to somebody in a similar situation as you? Either they're taking a little bit of time out from a degree, or they haven't done it at all. They're in their 20s. They're overachievers. They really, really want to do everything. What advice would you give them on getting into technology?
I would say networking is key. Like that is one of the things we talk about boot camps. We talk about all the online learning stuff. We talk about pet projects. To be honest, the thing that has gotten the most people their jobs in tech has been who they know. So networking is huge. You have to get out there somehow. And it doesn't matter if you are going to like a local PyLadies meetup, because Python has PyLadies. There's other groups. You can also just go to regular old meetups, but get out there and get networking. Practice talking to strangers and connect people on Twitter, connect people on Facebook. It doesn't need to be a deep connection. Like these do not need to be your best friends, but every job I have had has been through somebody who already knew me, because the first one was a friend. Like he was like totally a friend. The second one, I actually didn't have a friend there, but they had met me at conferences. Like several of them had met me at conferences, had shaken my hand. I actually didn't remember because I'd met so many people at this conference, but they remembered like meeting me and talking to me, and they watched my talks, which is going to be my point too. They'd watched my talks and they're like, oh, obviously somebody who knows what she's doing. So I interviewed there. That's how I got sought out. When my name came up in some mystical database where apparently when you start thinking about leaving your job, you end up getting entered into. Because I had been thinking about it. And then suddenly I had a recruiter.
When you like log back into LinkedIn for the first time in ages and it flags something in a database.
I have no idea what it is. But yeah, they all of a sudden they were upon me. And one of them that sought me out, they said, oh, they saw your name come up and they wanted me to talk to you. The third one was a friend who we had gone to the same meetup, and I had baked him a cake. Like when he left the area, because I love baking. But I baked him a cake, and when he was looking for somebody to succeed him at this company, he thought of me, and he actually was very strongly. He's like, "She's the one you want. She is the only one you want. You need to get her." And
Just eating cake in the background, like, yeah, she's great.
yeah, and it was one of those. But in every job, like pretty much that I've even had like interviews, there's a lot of them where it's like I knew somebody already on the inside. So networking is enormously huge, and it can be uncomfortable because if you're somebody who doesn't like getting out, that isn't comfortable talking to strangers, this is one of those places where I'm like, you gotta suck it up, because this is unfortunately part of it. My other thing is getting your name out there. I give lots of talks at conferences, and if you just search for my name on like YouTube, you'll come up with the talk. Actually, on my YouTube channel, I have a playlist of all the talks I've given, and it's actually missing a bunch of talks because there were a bunch of talks that I gave that either the recording didn't go through, or they just wasn't recorded. So, but giving talks gets your name out there, and it allows you to get some name recognition out there without having to go and shake every single hand at an event. And people say, I don't have anything to talk about, but the things I've talked about, I have only given, I think, one seriously technical talk. Every other talk has been about things like, I just gave one about writing technical interviews. I've given them about accessibility. I've given them about writing. So one of my keynotes is about how writing Harry Potter fan fiction can make your docs better.
Oh, how cool.
You know, I have all these weird, and I have funny talks, and I have short talks, and I have serious talks. And they're about things I know. And there actually is a place for people to talk about how I learned how to do something. There is a great talk from Pi, Ohio about ponies and machine learning. It's a guy who talks about how he learned machine learning via betting on racehorses.
How fantastic.
And the talk really isn't something you'd watch and go, now I know how machine learning works. He really is just going through his process of trying to learn about something and then losing a lot of money. Like that's really like what the talk is about, but it's a fascinating talk. And so there's lots of places for people to give talks and learn how to do this. And yes, are you going to maybe struggle the first few times you give a talk? Probably. You could also blog. That helps get your name out there, but I'll warn you, the blog world is a tiny bit oversaturated for many technical blogs, so you've got to have an angle or a voice or something. But just finding a way to get your name out there really, really helps. Because as I said, my second job, I don't remember meeting anybody, but they remembered me. And when my name came up, they were like, get her on the phone. So
your advice is network on or offline. If you're okay with the idea of public speaking, get up on a stage. If you're not, start writing and blogging, but be aware that the market's going to be a little bit busy. It's going to be a noisy environment to step into.
Yeah. Although, what's funny is that when I interviewed for my job at Speak Agent, there wasn't a technical interview.
Okay.
Because they didn't have one. And also the guy kind of knew my chops already. So, and they weren't interviewing anyone else. It wasn't like there was a huge competition. This was one of those positions where they will hire the right person when the right person comes. So in order to talk about it, he's like, well, can you give me a code sample? And I thought, crap, I can't, because working at NASA, all of my code was private. It belonged to NASA. And I said, oh, no, wait. I have something. I have a blog series I wrote about I was learning Pygame, and I was writing a roguelike in Pygame. So would that work? And he's like, oh, yeah, that would work. So what's funny is he went,
oh, cool.
Yeah, he read the series of blog posts, and he's like, oh, okay, cool. And he read it. So that is something, it's just not necessarily good for name recognition, but it is something that's good you can put that in your resume, that if you have a series of technical posts, that it's like, here's a link to my blog where I talk about how I learned blah and my experiments with blah. I hate recommending, I usually advise people who are interviewing to not skew too heavily on private, on side projects, because not everybody has time to do them.
It's really a proof of who has time and support around the house to make things like that happen.
It is. And then I turn around, and to new developers, I'm like, do a side project just because I know the reality. It's like I try to counsel the people who are giving the interviews to a better world, and I try to counsel people who are taking interviews to the realities. So
here's the way we could be if everybody did better. But by the way, folks aren't doing better yet. Here's what the tests are likely to look like.
yes. So it's one of those things, and it's although I do suggest to new people who are learning to develop in something new, a pet project is a good thing to do just to learn how to do something. So if you're trying to transition into tech and you're learning all of these things, having a pet project or two, just consider it homework. Figure out a way to squeeze it into your schedule. I don't think it's fair for companies to expect that developers are going to spend their entire weekend like coding and working on all their pet stuff. And because it's like my weekend is spent knitting and sewing. So I don't have time to like code. I have projects.
And naps, I hope.
Well, yeah, and that. But when you're transitioning from one career to another into tech, the unfortunate reality is you probably are going to have to set aside like weekend time to buckle down and get some proof of concepts out there. Yeah, and one of the things I actually recommend to people is start with a portfolio site, or just start with a portfolio like this is a me page, a personal site. That's what I'm talking about, personal site. Just something to throw things up on there that you've done and to prove that you actually know how to get like words up on the internet. Work in things where you're learning that framework or that language. Try to put stuff together. Just try to put together a portfolio since you don't have a previous job necessarily to point to and say, I did that. Although it's also, I ask people, it's like, look at your previous jobs and ask yourself, what here did I do that actually was technical? Like I was a receptionist, but as a receptionist, I did all the SQL queries for the company and all the technical support for the company. It was an old-fashioned engineering firm, and the accounting office did not know how to deal with SQL databases. And I did because I had some experience in it and I had played around with PHP. So I was the one that would run their queries for them. I made sure that made it onto every resume. I made sure that was highlighted, that I did SQL and I did the technical support for them when something went wrong on a computer. I was the one that was good at computers, so I would go up and fix things, and I made sure that it was very clear that I did that kind of stuff because we do more technical things than we think.
Sorry, that's an incredibly valuable message, that take a look at what you've actually been doing. And oftentimes I'd say speak to someone else. A lot of times when you were a receptionist, maybe you weren't aware that running SQL queries is technical and is unexpected and glorious in your position.
Yeah.
Chatting to someone else and saying, I do all of these things in my job. Which ones of these things are relevant to these roles I care about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's in that kind of stuff. And that's also a great place where networking comes in because networking allows you, we were talking earlier about how people talk about other companies that are not great to interview for. This is where you find out. There isn't a mailing list you can be put on. Like you have to actually go talk to the people. Oh, and Slacks. There's also lots of technical Slacks now. All throughout the industry. So if you can find an invite to one of those, you can find a lot of people to chill out with. And I find that the Slacks tend to be a little bit more beginner friendly than IRC because most languages have like on I think it's like Free Cloud, or I forget what it's called. Most of them have like a channel or two. But I have found that they're mostly the old hand, the experts, people that have been doing this for years, and they're a little bit more abrupt because, they've been doing this forever and they're part of the old internet where it was, harsh or nothing. The Slacks tend to be a little bit gentler, that there are community rules and there are like, hey, be good, be cool, be good to everyone. And they have like specific channels for people who are beginning, who are, interviewing. One of the Slacks I'm in is called We So Crafty, and it's all technical people who craft.
Ooh.
But in that Slack, we also have a channel called Interviewing. And we will have people come, or tech, and people will go and they will talk about those specific things, which is one of the advantages over IRC because there's only so many like crazy like channels you can create. because I think it's like Freenode. Freenode is it. Freenode. There's like only so many that you can create and reasonably maintain. So that's another good place for people to go where there's kind of a low barrier for entry.
That's absolutely glorious and some really, really practical advice. Get out there, network on or offline, because a lot of people may not have access to physical spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Write what you can, talk about what you can, and then get into these Slack channels. We'll also be including links to the We So Crafty Slack sign up in the show notes. Katie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.